Nice meeting everyone. And so I'm going to talk about Scotland just now and the remote communities in Scotland. It does contrast somewhat with the presentations we've just had. Scotland is infinitesimally smaller than Chile and Canada. To start with, just cover a bit of background and context about the Scottish situation, and then I cover a little bit about the transport challenges and what policy initiatives have been occurring in Scotland, and then we'll maybe have some comments on, try and give some comments on policy, and then we'll have a few slides on transport appraisal in Scotland. Thank you. In Scotland, the Scottish Government defines different sets of communities by accessibility. There are eight categories, of which the ones of our interest are remote and very remote. And they distinguish as well between urban settlements and rural. So there is a sort of criteria which they get into, because sometimes I think if you look at something like the OECD definition, I think Lucy asked about definitions of remoteness. If you look at the OECD definition, Inverness, where I live, which is a city of 50,000, is classed as remote. It's not classed as remote in Scotland. So we're defining remoteness based on travel times to urban centres. And the definition is 10,000. That's the threshold they use. If you're within 10,000, if you're within 30 minutes of a settlement of 10,000, then you are classed as accessible. If you're past 30 minutes, you're remote, and if you're past 60 minutes, you're very remote. So pretty much all islands are very remote, and the areas which are covered in dark green are the remote areas. Now, if any of you know or travelled to Scotland, basically that constitutes the mountainous part of Scotland. Not mountains like we have in Chile or in Canada, but still high land which is not particularly habitable. Population of those remote areas, 70% of the land area, 10% of the population. We have had decline in population over that time, not much, 4%, but that is against the population growth in Scotland as a whole. So you see the paths are diverging. But what is more concerning for the policymakers is that the people who are declining are the young people. They're the ones who are migrating out. So what the implication is that our population decline is going to accelerate going into the next 30 years because there are no young people moving into the remote communities. So they're thinking of, on current trends, it's 26% decline over the next 30 years compared to a 4% decline over the last 25 years. We have lower in the remote areas, we have lower output per head, and that does vary across the area than the Scottish average. Like other areas, we have it's an economy that's focused towards the primary sector. Whilst you see every aspect of an economy, apart from maybe merchant banking in the Highlands and Islands, what you see is that there's more people in the primary sector and in the tourism sector than in other parts of the economy. We also, as in other sort of rural areas, we have high car dependency, and you can see that in a number of statistics that come out of the Scottish Transport surveys and other household surveys. Larger numbers of driving licences, more cars per household, less bus use, those sorts of indicators. And we also have higher costs of travel there. That's two reasons. One is that you travel further because places are further apart. And secondly, the price of the petrol and the like and the ferry fares, that there's more of them. They're higher. I think it's also worth giving a little bit sort of other background here, is that Yeah, we're in a position where I guess the road and the ferry and the rail network were defined many, many years ago. I don't know how old some of these routes are, but this goes back certainly before my professional lifetime. The network structure that we have. So we're not in the Chilean situation about creating a new rural transport network. We're actually in a situation where we're trying to maintain it and make marginal changes to it. So within that context, there's also got to be an understanding here of the other determinants of remote communities, and we've talked about education and health. So in Scotland, education is compulsory for all people. They've got to be in some form of children. Got to be in some form of education to the age of 16, and the local authority and the government is obliged to provide that education. Now, I guess that then is, well, how does the local authority provide that education? Well, it's used of different things. It buses people to schools in remote areas. It's also chosen in places to actually take people and put them in hostels far away from their home, and that's particularly for high schools. And it was argued, 30 years ago, that this removing the children from the islands and putting them in hostels on the mainland was actually accelerating depopulation. So there was a big effort to increase the amount of schooling, and part of that actually was through increasing transport infrastructure. So we do see that in places that, where there's been transport infrastructure on islands and connectivity on the mainland has been improved, we see the hostels associated with some of these high schools closing. And so the children can stay at home. It's also really important to, we have a National Health Service, we've had that was established in 1948. There are hostels on all the major island hospitals on all the major island groups, but specialist healthcare nowadays, once upon a time, that was probably all the sort of treatment you would ever get. It could be provided, but nowadays our technology and our healthcare technology has moved on so much that the specialist treatment that a lot of us will require at some point can only be provided in certain hospitals. And those, for us, are primarily Edinburgh and Glasgow, Aberdeen, and to an extent, Inverness. So we see that there's a sort of hierarchy there. And everyone has a right to healthcare as well. So this is a sort of some maps of Scotland and some of the connectivity that is provided on the road, rail, ferry, and the air network. The important point that these networks, particularly the road, the two left-handed graphics, the road and the rail and ferry, these are actually what we would call the strategic road network and the strategic rail network. They are sort of managed by the Scottish Government, Transport Scotland. On top of or under that, you've got a whole network of local infrastructure, local roads, some places local ferries as well, and they are delivered, they are managed, and they're funded by local government. So we've got two ways of delivering transport services in remote areas. Because the key point about, I guess, the trunk road graphic here is that you can see that the strategic road network penetrates the remote areas. And that's quite, because remote communities need access to the main cities, but they also need local access too. So there's two requirements to the demand here. And so you've got how these two levels interact, the government side and the delivery of these services, is quite important. In the graphic on the right-hand side, there was a query about competition in Greg. He's gone now. A query about competition. We in the air sector, we have some PSO air networks and the island groups in the top right-hand corner, covering the connectivity between different islands there, and they have pretty much been solely operated by one operator for the duration, Loganair. No one else bids. it's to do with the aircraft, it's to do with familiarity, it's to do with the pilots. It's very hard, but we have to do the privatisation. It's important as well to understand that we in Scotland are still, fortunately, part of the European Commission, European Union, but that also places demands on us legislatively. So we have to separate out infrastructure from services. And this is the same across the European Union. So whilst our roads are all public sector and publicly owned, our rail network is subdivided into infrastructure and services. Though in actual fact, currently at the moment, they're both publicly owned. The infrastructure was once privatised. Ferries, again, it's got to be separated out. Infrastructure, services, and we also have a holding company that owns the vessels. So there's 3 tiers to the ferries, and this is all to do with so-called competition, when in reality, no one wants to bid for the ferries apart from the incumbent. So we have this setup, and it's the same with air. So we've got the services and then the infrastructure. Now, the infrastructure can actually be owned with the ferries, by the ports and harbours aren't all owned by the government. They can be owned by privately, or they can be owned. There is the infrastructure company can own some of them, and they're funded through harbour dues. All right. The other point to make is that we call this bit where it goes sort of blue south. We call everything there. We call that the central belt, like the belt of Scotland. Yeah, and that we have a motorway network. So I should stay near the microphone. We have a motorway network in that area, but outside of that, apart from the roads linking to England, it's all single carriageway roads. And we also have, in the Highlands, we also have what are called single track roads. So single carriageway road is where it's only one carriageway and you have a dividing line in the middle. And a single track road, and excuse me if you know this already, a single track road is where there is only room for one car on the road. And if you meet a car coming the other way, or a cow or a sheep, you have to stop. And so there's passing places. So the quality of the roads is very variable, and the sort of more local you get, the more it diminishes. So you could probably, when I talk about transport challenges, you could probably immediately start putting together your own list just based on your own experience or your own guesswork of what is happening. Now, in this list here of transport challenges, which I've drawn together from reading policy documents and other of work of other people's research, I would say I'm using words like slow, high, poor. This is relative, not an international benchmarking. This is relative to other places in Scotland. And I guess we're always comparing ourselves to our neighbours. And when you come to a place like this, you suddenly see that in actual fact, I mean, I kind of know that anyway, that what we have is actually very good. And so there is a sort of degree of relativity here. But we have slower journey times in the Highlands and Islands, partly due to the poorer infrastructure. We've got higher travel costs, poor network resilience. What do we mean by that? Well, some of our infrastructure, particularly our ferries, are getting old. They're about 30, 40 years old now, and they're coming time for that renewal process. And partly they're not being renewed because there's new legislation associated with health and safety regarding what these new ships should be like and what they should perform. You can get a waiver if you have got an existing new ferry, but you can't get a waiver for a new ferry. So it becomes very expensive to replace. And the issue why resilience is a problem is because if there is no service, then how do you get from A to B? So on the road network, the diversion routes can be very, very long. We're seeing at a local level, bus services are under pressure. So we've had a situation of, 2008, James referred to the coalition government coming in. We had the financial crisis, and we've been in a position of austerity, as they've called it, for the last 10 or 11 years, where government budgets have been cut year on year, particularly local authorities. So local authorities have been struggling to fund their services, and with the things they start cutting, things at the margin, such as bus services. There's seen as the other issue. There's seen as a complementarity between transport, or there's a substitutability between transport and digital connectivity, and we don't have full digital connectivity across the Highlands, which means that you don't get that substitutability all the time. And I also see, I mean, we all see that one of the problems as a transport economist or a transport planner is it's easy when your demand level is constant. It's really hard to cater sufficiently when your demand levels are seasonal. And, you know, but I mean, as an economist, if you sit there in an objective way, you say, well, of course, what I'd do is I'd have a little bit of congestion at my peak. But what does that mean? What that means is visitors can't get to islands, ferries get booked up in the summer season, and locals can't then get off the island on an emergency trip because the ferry is full. And that is an issue. But then you go to the islands in the winter, and there's one car on a ferry that could take 50 cars. And you've got this massive ship travelling backwards and forwards with hardly anyone on. And that is a huge issue associated, you know, with how when you have high seasonality, how do you cater for or how do you provide infrastructure for that that doesn't give that underutilization and overcapacity situation? I mean, as I said, you know, we've had a very you know, established situation in Scotland. The air network services in the local islands, the PSOs, have been in existence for well, I don't know when they came into existence, in the 1990s, I think. The rail network was built around the Inverness area in the early 1900s and has been operating since then. I mean, obviously the subsidies have then crept in over time. The ferry network was initially was run on a commercial basis back in the 1900s or 1890s as a form of communicating up the west coast and delivering mail, and gradually that's come under subsidy. I mean, it was up where maybe it wasn't run fully commercial because they were looking for commissions to deliver the post. So it was always subject to some kind of tendering process and subcontracting. But that then has given us this established ferry network that currently, and at revenue levels, the Scottish Government, I think, is paying out 170 million a year to support. But they haven't just stopped there. I mean, there's been a number of other initiatives of late. In the last 20 years, we've had discounts for concessionary bus travellers, and that covers ferry fares to an extent. We've got airfare discounts for residents. There's been a significant effort to reduce ferry fares. The Norway, I know, he works in Norway, isn't Norwegian, but the Norwegians were always held up as the great example of what we should be having in Scotland about the cheaper ferry fares. And so the Scottish Government has recently, well, in the last 10, 15 years, has introduced road equivalent tariffs on the ferry fares. There's been a reduction in fuel duty in remote areas, and there's been there was a dabbling. In other countries, people don't mind paying tolls, but it's not been very popular in Scotland. And there was a bit of a dabbling with using private finance to build bridges and use tolls to recover that in Scotland with the Skye Bridge, and that's been brought back into public ownership. So the tolls were removed. There's also ongoing investment in the rail, in the rail network, in the Highland Main Line, going up to Inverness. I should backtrack a little. So if you're looking from the central belt and you're going to Inverness, which is the junction between the blue and the red, in the not quite the top right-hand corner, then the lines that are going up through the centre of Scotland, the blue line on the road, that is the A9, that is being invested in. Aberdeen over on the east coast, and there's a red line cutting across east to west, that's the A96, that is being invested in. On the rail network, you've got parallel investment on the Highland Main Line. And these are all quite substantial investments by the Scottish Government that are going on, that are benefiting remote communities. So we have a hierarchy in our government structures, well, as everyone does. But we have the European Union's set of laws sit above everything. And then we have the UK government, then we have the Scottish Government, and then we have, well, local authorities, and in between we have regional transport partnerships, which are more of a coordinating body. The European Union and the UK government, primarily in remote communities, have a regulatory role. So it's health and safety legislation. It's the European Union is about competition policy and things to do with freight to get the commodities across the European Union. Local authorities are dealing with the lower level of provision for the local trips, and nominally we have the Scottish Government covering strategic. But what is strategic? This is always the difficulty. When does a local trip become a strategic trip? You know, and there is this sort of uncertainty there, and this is where So that's one issue. So in some aspects of things, because the Scottish Government has control over the rail network, well, to an extent, the rail network covers local trips. So the Scottish Government looks after local trips as well as strategic trips. It also looks after some of the ferries, which arguably are local too. They're not always strategic. So there's a mixture of what is going on here. I think what is also really important is that government is always refining, or central government is always reforming. I mean, you could say the transport is the casualty of these reforms. So we've got two major reforms that have happened in Scotland over the last 25 years. One is the breakup of all the kind of the larger local authorities into 32 local authorities, smaller ones. Some of them are very, very small. And the other was one which was called the Single Outcome Agreement in 2008, where instead of the Scottish Government saying to the local authorities, right, you've got to spend, 30% of your budget on transport, 30% on education, whatever, it said, here's your money, do with it what you want. Achieve the outcomes that you are supposed to achieve. And that seems like a really good idea, to an extent. And so we've got these two levels of government reform going on. So I'll cover transport finances to start with, and then talk about the breakup of the local authorities. So what we see when what has happened when the local authorities, and this builds on, the lady said about what the road communities in North Canada do if they get given the money. They don't spend it on transport. What we're seeing is the local authorities are prioritising education investment over transport investment. And so we get a build-up of education investment in the red line, and we see a decreasing amount of capital expenditure on transport. Now, it's also important to see this in the context of falling local authority budgets. So year on year, the budgets are falling for the government, but on top of that, the local authorities are not prioritising transport. This is local authorities. Scottish Government has maintained its interest in transport investment over this time. In fact, if anything, the nationalist government that we have is more rural-dominated, more rural-focused than the previous Labour administrations, which were more city-focused. And what we see is large investment by the Scottish Government in strategic transport services. So I've got some examples. On the left-hand side, you've got what is happening in the strategic network, and on the right-hand side, you have what is happening in the local transport network. So in the roads, we're seeing it's not all happening this year. I mean, it's happening over a period of 20 years or so. 6 billion investment in getting the A9 and the A96 upgraded, which will benefit remote communities. And yet local authorities are deferring investment in the local road network. I think in Argyll and Bute, 27% of the roads are at an extreme level of needing rehabilitation. We have massive investment in ferries. We've got 2 ferries that were commissioned for a total of 97 million. The price actually doubled, and the company that's making them has gone bankrupt, and the Scottish Government has just nationalised it a month ago. And at the same time, we've got a local ferry network that is teetering along with vessels that are 30 to 40 years old. And we have an airfare discount scheme for remote residents to fly into central parts of Scotland. And yet, at the same time, we've got local authorities' bus networks contracted by 16%. Now, this isn't a criticism this is actually comes down to choices that people are making, the different governments are making, or different strategies the government are making, and it's something we can think about and discuss. This is a map of the local authorities, which I turn to. So you have the 32 local authorities are there. You can see that we are only a region. We are a population of 5 million, and that is how we are. That's the number of local authorities we have. What we tend to find is that transport journeys are cross-boundary. Okay, so being cross-boundary, that tends to mean that there's a gap in the so let me get this right. Local transport journeys can be cross-boundary, I should say, which means that local authorities are at too small a level to be able to manage deliver the transport service that's required for that cross-boundary trip. Obviously, so you want to go up a level, but the next level up is Scottish Government. Okay, so they introduced when they created the 32 local authorities, that is now referred in the literature as a hollowing out of governance. So that we lost the ability to control the transport system on some of these local trips. And then they created the regional transport. Well, firstly they were voluntary partnerships, and then which then became compulsory, and that's called a filling in. So what we see in the Highlands and Islands is a strong desire to collaborate, because there's a lot of mutual interest, and there's a lot of kind of local trips that are crossing these boundaries in the remote areas. However, so that's filling in. But however, it's now argued that the way it is structured has led to what they now call overstuffing, which actually has led to a degree of paralysis where the local authorities aren't wanting, they want to collaborate to an extent, but they don't want to join forces completely. And so there's inertia and uncertainty, which is actually paralysing the actual development of solutions at a local level for local transport. That is what we are seeing. The other key point, what I should add to that is that, obviously, I'm not the person who identified all this, and the Scottish Government has been looking at this for some time, and in the new transport strategy, which is out in draft form at the moment for consultation, this is an area which they're going to be looking at, and just trying to strengthen the role of the regional transport partnerships, or certainly looking at what their role should be, to try and get some movement here. The other aspect is that we have, and this comes across, we've already been discussing about this. Now, what about the crossover between the different service delivery? Now, what is different about Scotland compared to the other two countries we've heard of is that the Orkney Islands, for example, has an inter-island air service. It has one of the air services is the shortest scheduled air service in the world, 1.5 minutes long, between Papa Westray and Westray. So there's very short distances that are being covered here, okay, by air. The ferry services are taking a bit longer, 45 minutes sometimes, but generally speaking, these islands are in relatively close proximity to each other. This allows for some quite what you would think of now, what you're seeing here, is quite innovative way of delivering services. So in Orkney, for example, you have there are some islands which are large enough to have a high school, and there are other islands which aren't. So the ones which haven't got a high school, the kids have to come into what they call mainland, which is the biggest island, and they stay in a hostel for the week, and they go back at weekends. So that's an education trip. Monday morning, Friday night, going back. But the islands which are big enough to have a high school, the specialist teachers, the ones who maybe only teach in French, I don't know, some languages, they will just go out for 1 or 2 days a week. And they fly out in the morning, and then they come back. And they can cover different islands on different days. So what you see is we see 40% of the demand for local air services in Orkney is education related. Now, clearly, if we didn't have that air service, and remember, air education has to be provided, you know, by the local authority, you would expect the cost of providing education services to go up. In Argyll, the situation is similar, but here, there, it's the health service that is the biggest user of the air services. And that's both for flying patients off the islands to medical appointments, but more importantly, sending health professionals out to do clinics on the island. There's been some studies about bus services. So this is when we talk about a good bus service, we're talking about coordinating bus services with patient appointments. We're talking about getting that coordination between, so missed appointments, getting treatment done on time, these sorts of things. And the argument here is that a good bus service can save the NHS up to £2. £1 spent on a good bus service can save the NHS double that at £2. But the problem we have is that the education service, the health service, and the transport service, they don't talk to each other. So these services, so sometimes you see these good examples, but these are exceptions rather than the norm. And that is, but we see in Scotland, there is a strong crossover between remote transport services and provision of health and education services. And getting better coordination is really important. But people have mentioned about appraisal, and we've also talked about these remote communities where their service is the only link. Now, we call that a lifeline service in Scotland. Now, we actually have only got, as far as I'm aware, only one community which has got no road access. It hasn't actually got an air service. So we're not in that game. So our lifeline services are actually, we still call an air service, which to Barra we would see that as a lifeline service, even though it's got a ferry service as well. But the ferry is 4 or 5 hours long. So I guess the main thing about transport appraisal in Scotland is we have what we call a business case. So we have to put a business case together. And it consists of 5 things. We have a strategic case, an economic case, a commercial, financial, and a management case. The last 3 are kind of management related. The 2 key decision makers, so the 2 critical ones that certainly we get involved in is in the strategic case and the economic case. So the strategic case is like policy arguments for doing a project. The economic case is what we call a cost-benefit analysis, value for money analysis. Now, strictly speaking, a project needs to pass each of these cases to go ahead. But there's no definition of what a pass is. Okay? It's a judgmental decision. A lot of everything in this appraisal in Scotland and in UK in general is very judgmental. So we have these cases, but there isn't really a pass mark. You've got to pass it, but there's no definition of what a pass is. It'd be a nightmare if that was how your exams were marked. And I guess a key element in here is that it's recognised that not all costs and benefits in the cost-benefit analysis, in the economic case, can be valued. And therefore, judgmental decisions are therefore, are permitted. So that's the core structure which the Treasury in Westminster sets down to us. Now, in Scotland, we use the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance, which maps onto this process. And this is made up this goes through stages of development. But I won't go through this. So at the end of the day, you set out why you want to do a project, and this might take many years to get through because you've got to get through the decision making, and then you commission another study that's decided that we're going to go forward with this. But at the end of the day, what you're coming out with is a preferred option. That's the idea. And what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the appraisal, particularly the Part 1 appraisal, you will see is against transport planning objectives. Okay? Now, those are local. Those are defined based on an assessment of the problems and needs of the community. So the idea is that no project will ever make it from Part 1 to Part 2 unless it meets the needs of the community. So there's a sifting process that goes through there. And then we come up with this at the end. The idea is that the project that comes out of that will be meeting the needs of the local community, but will also meet general Scottish Government policy objectives and will be fully appraised against all of those. So now I want to turn to the situation which we've covered a little bit, we've been alluded to here about cost-benefit analysis and weak economic cases, because the bottom line is that we think that transport projects in remote communities might have weak economic cases. So the first point about what happens in Scotland is that passing the economic case, which is, I guess, a benefit-cost ratio of 1 or more, is not necessary if there are significant unmonetised benefits. Now, how do we know whether there are or not? Well, often that then hinges around a strategic case, what we would say. The strategic case has to be strong for the investment. So it's a bit like the isolation analysis that you are doing. So there are examples, and here are 2 examples of where investment is going on at the moment or has just finished in two projects with low benefit cost ratios. So one is the Borders Rail project with a benefit cost ratio of a half, going from Edinburgh South into the remote area down there, and then the second is the Perth to Inverness. The problem, however, is despite this concept of that we will invest in projects with low benefit cost ratios, local stakeholders feel that a poor economic case undermines their projects. They feel it reduces investment in remote regions, and they feel that the choice of which project to take forward at the end of the part 2 is based on minimum cost provision and not what is the best project performing, or is not the best project. So there is this sort of discord element. I mean, I guess one has to sort of ask whether it's possible to improve the economic case. Well, I would say that there are a number of reasons why we would think that transport projects in remote areas the economic case might be undermined. Firstly, we've got high costs of travel, and if we can reduce those costs of travel significantly, we get a large increase in demand. So we've got to be able to model the increases in demand very well. Standard methods don't give us an allowance of cost-benefit analysis, often don't give us measures of how we have to adjust our schedules. Most of us probably would have had to adjust our schedule to get here. But that wasn't actually a travel time. When I heard, including myself actually, and I should have known this, no one said here, oh, I had to travel on Saturday, I couldn't get a flight on Monday morning to get here. There wasn't one that could have got me here on time. No one said that. You all adjusted your schedules. Now that's a daily part of people's lives in remote communities, and that has social value if we can allow them to have more flexibility in their schedule. Network resilience, the perception of being cut off prevents investment. There's a social element to that. The problems of driving on single carriageway roads in a stop-start manner and platooning, that's an element of comfort factor. We value comfort on trains. We don't value it in driving in the Highlands. The issue of the next 2 points are interlinked. We've earlier talked about what happens if we don't provide an air service to a community that is dependent on the air service. Well, that's 2 things. What is going to happen without that community? What's going to happen? So we have some populations in Chile with 10 families. That's got no connectivity. So is this population of 500 going to go down to 10? That's modelling land use change. And then there's the other element is can we get the costs of that into the due minimum. And so we've got the modelling land use change and the attractiveness benefits of being connected to people, and then capturing that element in the due minimum. Ophelia has mentioned some work I've done on wider economic benefits, and there can be additionality if we create employment in these areas, which can add up to 40% of the benefits I've found. But what I would say is that these areas are areas of research that we would need to engage in. That there are ways we can take this forward, but they're not available today very easily, and it's something for the future. So that doesn't solve the problems for today. So there would need to be a research effort, and probably an international effort, to push this forward. And in terms of that, I would say that some of these benefits are not actually missing. These missing benefits are not purely associated with remote communities. Some of them are very current to modern thinking or issues that we are dealing with in the UK in general. So we're talking about in the UK, they're talking about rebalancing the economy and shifting economic activity from London to the north. and Scotland. That is no different from the situation we're talking about repopulating islands or sustaining population in islands. So the economic concepts and the methodologies that need to be developed are parallel, are common across this. So, and the issue on resilience, network resilience, is also very important in the rail network at the moment in the UK. So research on these areas, if they are taken forward, would benefit not only remote communities appraisal, but also more central government appraisal on congested areas. So just to summarise, in Scotland we've got a good background in our legislation and our policies, but we are still there's a need for significant investment to maintain the existing services. They're coming to the end of their life, particularly the local services. There are differences, we've got differences between local and central government investment, and we're finding that in remote communities we're getting, this is against the backdrop of austerity and falling budgets in both the health service, the education service and local government. We're finding that the coordination between these services and the cuts are causing us problems. And so the question we sort of pose is there a stronger role for regional government in trying to resolve some of those issues? We have a good appraisal framework in Scotland. We like to think we have. And projects can be selected which have weak economic cases. But there is concern by local stakeholders as to whether this is actually leading to all their schemes being developed, and if they are being taken forward, whether it's actually just minimum cost, reduced levels of investment, minimum standard is offered. So the question I guess we have to pose is, should we be strengthening the economic case? Thank you very much.